Cross with bar. And I earned that distinction in World War I, the Great War, the war to end all wars. Now, you might not know me from my exploits during World War I. You probably know me from another ship. It's called, does anybody know? You might, what is it?
Probably the RMS Titanic.
Oh no, the Oceanic was a far more better ship. Yes, unfortunately I was on board, or some people say fortunately, I was on board the RMS Titanic when she made her fateful trip on April 10th, actually, 1912 is when she set sail. But I came on board many days before that, on March 20th, way back in Belfast. But before I got on board Titanic, I had many other adventures. You see, at the time Titanic sank, I was 38 years old. But you know how long I was already sailing at sea? 25 years. Wow. Do the math. How old was I when I first went to sea? 13. I was 13 years old when I first went to sea. You see, I was born in Courtleigh, Lancashire, England, which is near Liverpool. And at the time, my family owned a cotton mill, which 100 years or so before, with my great-something grandfather, he opened the business and it was very successful. But you see, as time went on, and you Yanks went and you had your wars, and you fought that very righteous war, where you freed the slaves, which was a good thing, but the price of cotton went up quite considerably, and so the family business wasn't doing so well. So when I was a young lad, I saw that the family business was in decline. I would probably have to get some factory work. And the very first time as a young boy I went to Liverpool, you know what I saw in the harbor? The tall ships with their beautiful masts and their rigging and the sails, and I thought of all the adventure that I could have. So at the splendid age of 13 years old, I was rather amazed when my guardians, my aunt and uncle, they signed me aboard as an apprentice on the Primrose Hill. Now the Primrose Hill was one of the most beautiful ships in Liverpool Harbor because she had 4 gallant masts, but on top of that, she had 3 sky sails. And sky sails were the masts on top of the masts. On top of the masts. On top of the masts. And some people thought they were just ornamental, but we know in our shipping line that they gave it a little bit extra speed, which is very important in a merchant ship, you see. Now my job as a young apprentice was to climb up and furl and unfurl those skysail masts, those skysail yarders. But here's the thing, they were so high, they were 200 feet above the deck of the ship. So no matter what the weather, if it was clear as a bell, if it was rolling, or sleeting, or raining, or snowing, I had to climb up those 200 feet. Now you know, it wasn't so bad the first 180 feet or so. It really wasn't. Because we had rigging, or what you might call rat's lines, that you can climb up there kind of like a ladder. But those last 20 feet, all there was a thin line going up to the yard that stuck out there, and you had to kind of shinny up like this. And the saying was in sailing ships in those days, one hand for yourself and one hand for the owner. Well, nobody ever furled a sail with one hand before. So the saying was, no matter what the weather, you had to go up and furl the sky sails. And so I remember the mates on board the Primrose Hill used to say this to me. Growl you may, Lightoller, but go you must. And not only that, sometimes we'd have to be there 200 feet above the deck, looking down at these little people down below. And we were up there sometimes for 7 or 8 hours at a time, no matter what the weather. But you know what? I love it. Because it was adventure. We got to travel the world. On my very first voyage, we traveled down along the North Atlantic, down along South America, and we rounded Cape Horn. And those of you who might think Cape Horn, well, if you're very south, it must be very warm. You're far from the truth. You're very close to the Arctic Circle, and it's very rough water there. As a matter of fact, on my very first voyage, I had an encounter. You see, there's a very similar night to one I've experienced 25 years later. The water all of a sudden got very calm. We moved into waters that suddenly got very cold. And there was no moon out, just brilliant stars all around. We couldn't see more than a few hundred yards in front of us. But we always, at that time, made sure we had an old sailor on board who knew the ways of the sea. And this gentleman was sitting out in the bow of the ship, peering cautiously, when all of a sudden he yelled out, "Iceberg, straight ahead!" And we all looked, but we didn't see anything. We didn't see anything either, you know why? smelled it. You see, you can smell an iceberg from a ways away, but you don't know exactly where it is, but he was fairly sure it was somewhere in front of us. So we laid anchor, as much as you can lay anchor in the Antarctic Ocean, you see, and we waited until morning. And in the morning, we found not an iceberg, but an ice field that was miles and miles long. It took us several days to get around it. Well, that taught me a thing or two about icebergs, I have to say. So, through the years, I encountered icebergs. On my second ship, called the Hotel, we actually were traveling from Africa over to Calcutta, and we were going to take a sharp turn to the north. It's a little island that was halfway between Africa and Australia called the Isle St. Paul. Has anybody ever heard of it? No? Well, it's only 4 miles wide. In the middle of the Indian Ocean. So we're heading towards that little island to make sure that we knew it was time to turn north towards Calcutta. But the captain I was with at the time was Jock Sutherland. And Jock was the biggest cracker-on in the entire merchant fleet, which meant he went as fast as he could, whenever he could. And his boast was, as long as I have one sail furled, no ship shall pass me. So it so happened, on that fateful day, we were traveling very rough water, and another ship did pass him. Jock found out about it because he was not on the bridge at the time, and he ordered us to get all the masts unfurled and to race that ship, and race we did. We raced it so good, we ran straight into the Isle of St. Paul and we were shipwrecked. So on my second voyage, here I am. I survived the iceberg. Now I'm on this little island where albatrosses attacked us. There was nothing to eat, and the water tasted like a mixture of rotten eggs and salt. Now, fortunately, after fewer than 2 weeks, we were rescued. Now, here's the remarkable thing. The ship that rescued us had a captain that wasn't even supposed to be in the area. He didn't just go a few hundred miles off course to find us. He went a few thousand miles off course to find us. You know why? He had a hunch. This captain of the ship, Courant, which saved us, told his crew, I think there's some sailors stranded on the Isle of St. Paul. Let's go fetch them. And he did. And he brought us back to Australia. Now, news of our rescue had already reached Australia, and we went to Adelaide in South Australia, and I have to say, Australia is a wonderful country, especially the ladies. And so when I got to Australia, we were treated like royalty. Everybody wanted to meet the survivors of the shipwreck of the Isle of St. Paul. And fortunately, I knew how to ride horses, so I was able to get some jobs there and stay a little bit extra longer, but finally, my master's back in England called me home. So shortly after that, I sailed on other ships. I got my master's certificate. I was on a ship later that had a coal fire in it because the coal in the bunker had fire. I caught malaria on one ship, for goodness sake, traveling around the coast of Africa. So finally, after quite a few years, I decided maybe I should give up the sea for a while and try something else. Well, as luck would have it, I found a little headline, and it said, "Klondike, make your fortune in gold in Canada." So guess what I did? I went to Canada. And I prospected for gold. And I traveled with another sailor and some other gentlemen, and we went through the Yukon, and we found nothing. We did find some fool's gold. And I have to say, I did feel like a fool for quite a while. But I had an adventure, I have to tell you. And I made my way back across Canada. I worked as a cattle wrangler, because as I said before, I knew how to ride horses, and that was quite grand. I helped build furniture and stands and things for a fair that was going on in the great city of Winnipeg. And then I traveled as a hobo, riding the rails across Canada all the way back to Montreal. And then my lucky stars, there was a ship traveling back to Liverpool. Unfortunately, this was a cattle ship. And riding as a cowboy out in the plains in Alberta is one thing on a horse, but being holed up with a bunch of cattle on a ship, not so fun, especially when the weather gets quite rough, you see. So when I got back to England, I decided to sign on with another ship straight away. And I signed on to a ship, and the gentleman who signed me up at the office said, "Oh yes, it's a very fine ship." When I got on board the ship, guess what kind of ship it was? It was a cattle ship. So at this time, I was 25 years old. And I figured I'd better be getting on with my career. So you know what I did? I put on my best clothes. I marched down to James Street. I went into the office of the White Star Line, and I said, "I'd like a job as an officer." You didn't know this, the White Star Line was the premier line in all of England, only rivaled by Cunard. But White Star was known to be grander with better accommodations and better food, which is very important to me, you see. So I thought I'd be lucky to get a berth on a ship in a few months. But you know what? They were quite impressed. And I had my first ship within 1 week. Within 1 week! She was called the Medic, and guess where my first trip was? To Australia! I got to go back again. And so at this time, if I had mentioned, the Boer War was going on in South Africa. And now Australia, you see, was part of the British Commonwealth. And the people of Australia were very eager to fight in the first battle for Mother England. And so when we came, we were actually a troop transport. And so they thought the people on board the Medic were grand people indeed, and we were treated again like royalty, and we spent many a long day there. And as a matter of fact, if I didn't say this, it was a bit of a prankster too. You see, in Sydney Harbour in Australia where we were, was an old fort called Fort Denison. You know why we built it? Because of you Yanks. At the time, some Yankee ships had actually come in many years earlier into Sydney Harbour or close by, and we thought we better protect ourselves. Well, you never did come back, but the fort stayed. So in this fort was a very big gun, and we thought, wouldn't it be fun if we could fire that gun and scare the people of Sydney and raise the Boer flag from South Africa and make them think the people from Africa had traveled all the way here? Well, the people of Sydney didn't find it so fun. But they never did find out who did it, except for, on the way back to England, one of my partners in crime, should we say, he was talking to other crew members, and I got back to the management of the White Star Line. So when I was called into the White Star Line manager's office, I was prepared. I had written up my letter of resignation. I went into the office. I handed my resignation. I sat down. Then the managing director, he actually talked to me, and he asked me what had happened, and I explained it. And all of a sudden, he started laughing. Then he started chuckling, and then he started guffawing, and he said, "Shh, get out of here, get back on your ship." And so I did. Let's just say that wasn't the last prank I played, but nothing else was quite as big. So through the years, I traveled on many other ships, and one of the ships actually did take me back to Australia, and on that ship was a young lady by the name of Sylvia Hawley Wilson, and she was the most exquisite creature I'd ever seen. She had been traveling with her aunt to England to study abroad, you see, and so when she was on board the ship, I took every opportunity to get to speak to the young lady. Now, as it happened, and she doesn't mind me saying this, she has a slight deformity in her foot, and it made it quite difficult for her to climb up and down the ladders. And so, being the gallant officer that I was, I offered to help her between decks. So you could say I literally swept her off. So I spent some time in Sydney, as we normally do, and when I came back to England, Sylvia came back as my bride. And we had 5 wonderful children: Roger, Trevor, Mavis, Doreen, and young Brian. Now, through the years, I traveled on many different ships for the White Star Line. One of them was the Oceanic, which I thought was one of the most beautiful ships afloat. And one of the captains I got to sail with quite often was a Mr. E.J. Smith. So you probably heard of Captain E.J. Smith before, because he was the captain during Titanic's maiden voyage. But I have to tell you, in my experience, in my time sailing with OBJ, any sailor would have given his right ear to sail with him. So I found it very lucky to be sailing on the night of April 14th and 15th. I had just gotten off my watch with the captain. We were talking about how the stars were and how calm the sea was. And he said that if there was any chance of icebergs ahead to come call it. Well, my watch ended and I went to sleep. And just as I was going to sleep, which was a little bit after 11:30 or so, I heard kind of a rumbling. I didn't think too much of it, but I did jump out of my berth and I went over on the port side of the ship and I looked out and I didn't see anything. Then I went over to the starboard side and didn't see anything there either. So I went back to my quarters, because the last thing the people on watch want is another officer there who's not supposed to be there. Besides, if they needed me, they would know where to find me. Well, not 10 minutes went by when one of the junior officers knocked on my door and said, "Captain, or Officer Lightoller, we've hit an iceberg." And I said, "I know you've hit something, I felt it." So I was wearing my pajamas, so I grabbed my pants, put those on, grabbed my jacket on, and went out to help and do what I can. Well, it wasn't too long after that we started loading the lifeboats, about an hour later, you see. And it was my job to load the lifeboats on the port side of the ship. Now, as I was doing this, the chief officer came over, and he was a little bit worried that some of the third-class passengers especially might get a little bit rambunctious, especially the men, and try to get into the lifeboats. So he suggested that we get the revolvers. Well, we'd never used revolvers before in any ship I'd been on. And since I was formerly the first officer, I was bumped down to second officer because at the last minute they had to change officers on board Titanic. So we went and we got these huge revolvers, which were still wrapped up, they still had the grease on them, and we stuck them in our pockets. Well, I'm glad I had that revolver later, because one of the last lifeboats on the port side, I went up to launch it, and there were a group of third-class men sitting in it. So I took the gun out of my pocket, I aimed it at these gentlemen, and I said, "Get out, you cowards! Get out right now! I hope you drown, all of you!" And they got out of the lifeboat right quick. What they didn't know was, I never loaded any bullets. So we managed to get women and children on board that ship. And as we were trying to get the last lifeboat launched, which was one of the collapsible boats with the canvas sides, the ship was sinking lower and lower in the water, and a huge wave came and crashed over the deck, and most of the other passengers had already gone up to the stern of the ship, you see. So at that point, we got the last ship launched. It floated away upside down, and at this point, the water starting to come up my legs. I could either go back with the masses, knowing that they only had the chance in the water like anybody, or I could do what any sensible person would do. I swam for it. So I jumped in the water, and I started to swim towards the crow's nest, but then it dawned on me. The crow's nest, it's connected to the ship. And the ship is going down. So I decided to start swimming away from the ship. So as I started doing that, though, I felt the suction on me. And all of a sudden, I was dragged back against the ship on a grate on one of the smoke funnels. The water was going down to the engine room, and I was stuck with it. And I was going down with the ship, and I was drowning. So I prayed up to the heavens for my guardian angels to look over me. And you must have heard my prayer. Because a blast of air hit those hot coal fires, and it blew up into the funnel, and it blew me out of the ship, and I made it back up to the water, and I was sucked down again. Now, I'm not quite sure what happened, because I don't remember praying the second time, you see. But I did make it back up to the water, and wouldn't you know it, that little upside-down lifeboat was floating there, and I managed to grab onto a rope. And at that moment, the forward funnel of the ship came crashing down, and I thought this was the end, but it missed me by inches and washed me away from the ship. So I managed to get on top of that upside-down lifeboat, and there were about 30 other men there, including the radio operators, Mr. Phillips and Mr. Broad. So we couldn't take any more passengers on board that ship. We were standing upside down, 30 of us on that lifeboat, and it was all we could do to stay afloat, because you see, it was never fully launched. And as the evening went on, the morning, the seas got rougher. It had been smooth, but then the waves started swelling like this, and I knew we were going to be swamped. So I ordered all the men in that lifeboat to stay perfectly still, and after we said the Lord's Prayer, what we did, as I would say as a wave came, lean to the left! And here's another wave. Lean to the right! No, straight on! And I did that for hours so we wouldn't sink. And then as the light of day came up, I could see that our ship was going, our little boat was going to go down soon, but I saw some lifeboats off in the distance, but they couldn't hear us. So what I did is, I pulled out my trusty officer's whistle, and we got their attention, and they came over and got us, but you see, that boat was overloaded too. So we had to row like the dickens to look for the rescue ship Carpathia, which we saw in the distance, and we barely got there before we were all lost. So when I got on board the Carpathia, I happened to see a man there by the name of Dean, who had sailed with many other ships. And he said, "Lights, what are you doing here?" And I said, "I'm the last survivor of time." Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you have many questions to ask, and the evening is getting on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to disappear so you can talk to Rob. So I do have one more story to share after we have some questions and answers, and I know the night's getting on, so let's take at least a few questions. So who'd like to go first?
The collapsible lifeboat number 8 that you passed around looked like it had only maybe a dozen people in the photo, but on the back side were at least 24 names or so.
Yeah, actually, the photos that you're seeing, I'm pretty sure I had them accurate on there. Sometimes it's deceiving when you look to see how many people are in there, because the full lifeboats could hold 65 people, The emergency rowboats could hold, I think it was 40-some people, and then the collapsible boats could, I think, hold about 45 or so. So it's a little deceiving when you look at them about what the capacity is, but a lot of lifeboats did go out, not full at all. The main reason was, in the beginning, people didn't want to get into the lifeboats. Plus, we saw this boat off in the distance, and we thought that boat was going to come to the rescue. Plus, these new lifeboats were being lowered by something called Welland davits, which are the rigging that lowers them into the water. And most of the officers, including Lightoller, were not familiar with them. And we didn't think it was safe to lower people in the dark 70 feet down to the ocean. So we figured we'd lower them part way, open the gangway doors, and then load people from there. But the people who went down to the gangway doors must have got caught in the water and died, because they never did make it down the gangway doors. Other questions? Yes, sir.
The steel plates,
Yes.
there, I don't know if there's controversy, but there was something about the rivets, either they were, had hydrogen embrittlement when they were manufactured. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, basically what happened is the steel in Titanic was state-of-the-art. So it was 1-inch thick plates. It was, you couldn't get better steel at the time from what was known. As far as the rivets go, they were made locally, and they were inconsistent is the issue. So some of them were better than others, but they didn't think too much of it because they didn't think they'd be in those kind of conditions. When the water was that cold, it actually did make some of the rivets very brittle. And what happened when Titanic struck the iceberg is the iceberg didn't gash a hole in the Titanic. What it did was put pressure against the plates, which made the rivets pop out. And so it was these plates popping open that caused the water to rush into the ship. So that's what happened. What other questions do you have? Over here. No? Yes.
Isn't it true that there's not enough lifeboats for the passengers?
Yes.
and crew?
Yes. So at the time, Titanic had 20 lifeboats, which according to the British Board of Trade was more than enough. She had 16 regular lifeboats and then emergency boats and collapsible boats. But the problem was the British Board of Trade regulations weren't keeping up with the advancement in the size of the ships. It had nothing to do with the number of passengers on board. Did that change after Titanic?
Yes.
Absolutely. Now, even if all of the lifeboats had been fully loaded, there would still have been, I'm trying to think, about 1,100, 1,200 people that would have perished. But there definitely were not enough on board. Other questions?
In the movie, and I don't know if this is true or not, third class passengers were, they shut the gates and locked them in. Is that true?
No. I have to say that's a bunch of poppycock. Because basically the gates for the third class passengers were not required by the British Board of Trade or the White Star Line. The gates were required by, does anybody know? The United States government.
Oh.
Because it was an immigration ship, it was assumed that third class passengers could be carrying contagious diseases. And at the time in 1912, where did every immigrant coming to the east coast of the United States have to do? Go through Ellis Island and stay in quarantine. So if they had to be in quarantine on Ellis Island, they had to be in quarantine on the ship. Now, some of the gates were locked, and some of that was because of just miscommunication and not being able to find a key. But they did try to get the passengers out of there. The biggest problem with the third-class passengers was language. They didn't understand English when people were giving them instructions what to do. And they were in the lower parts of the ship, and there was a bit of a maze to get up to the ship, and directions weren't very good at the time. So that's the biggest reason that so many third-class passengers were there. And men and women were separated in a lot of cases. And so the men and women were trying to find each other instead of going up to the lifeboats. Any other questions? Over here.
Yeah, I remember watching the Titanic with Leonardo DiCaprio, and it shows the doors coming down.
The watertight doors?
Yeah. No.
The watertight doors weren't truly watertight. Water could actually get over the top of them. So think of an ice cube tray. As an ice cube tray fills up, and the one compartment fills up, what does it do? It spills into the next compartment. They thought they were high enough, and there were enough compartments there that it wouldn't be an issue. She was actually designed so any of the first 4 compartments could be flooded. She'd still stay afloat, but 6 compartments were damaged, so there's no way she could stay afloat. Again, regulations changed after that. Yes, sir.
So apparently it was common to sail when there's icebergs.
All the time. And it was not even common to sail when there were icebergs. It was common not to slow down unless you had word that there was one right in front of you. And remember what I said before? Titanic didn't get that last message to the bridge because the Marconi operators were backlogged sending messages, and they had already sent umpteen million messages about icebergs, but none of them were right in front of the ship. If they had gotten that one last message, they would have known.
Aren't there some, are there any of them, are they always above water, or are there some like
No,
submerged?
some are actually right at surface level. They're called growlers, and you really can't see those very well at all. Those are the most dangerous.
So how do you, I mean, why do they go in, why do they sail when they?
Regulations have changed.
No, those.
And I'll have to say this, since Titanic, how many lives have been lost in the North Atlantic Ocean due to icebergs? 0. 0. Because many changes were made. There's now an international ice patrol. There's obviously radar, there's better communication. They've moved the shipping channels further south, depending on the time of the year. Training is much better, there are enough lifeboats for everybody. So a lot of things happened, and a lot of that was because of Lightollers' testimony, because he was being pushed to name names and blame people and blame industries or blame companies. But he knew it wasn't the company or Captain Smith or J. Bruce Ismay. It wasn't that. It was the nature of the beast at the time. Everybody was doing it. They had to change the system, and the system was changed. Yes?
Were any of the lifeboats ever historically saved?
No, because one of the things that happened with lifeboats, this is getting into some legalities here, the only thing that people could claim against the Titanic was any property that remained, and so when they got back to the Carpathia, some of the lifeboats had been rounded up. Long story short, it ended up being distributed to other White Star Liner ships and repainted, so they didn't come from Titanic anymore. So they were put back into use, so that's the story. Yeah.
I forgot, when I was at Whitehall, it was second officer. Was Murdoch first officer under?
Henry Tinkle Wild was the chief officer. First officer Murdoch was first officer, then Lightoller. Now what's confusing, I didn't have time to explain this. Shortly before Titanic sank, it was a matter of a couple of days, I think, they decided to bring the chief officer from the Olympic, remember the sister ship? They decided to bring her on board Titanic, which bumped the chief officer down to first, Lightoller the first down to second, and the second officer, Davy Blair, was bumped off the ship altogether. Now Davy Blair, who was supposed to be the second officer, his quarters were the ones that had the safe that had binoculars in it, and he forgot to leave the key. Any other questions? Right here.
Is it true that the rescue ships like Carpathia brought in the bodies back of the wealthy people or the first class?
No, and actually I'm not sure if the Carpathia brought any bodies back. I have to look at that. But the McCabe Bennett was a ship from Halifax that was sent out, and they gathered the majority of the bodies, and they gathered whoever they could find. Now, depending if you were first class, second class, third class, depended how they stored you on board the McCabe Bennett, whether you were put in a body bag or a coffin or just a shroud. There was a difference there, but they collected every single body that they could find.
Bury them at sea if they were third class or something?
No, they tried anybody that seemed to be able to make it back to Canada, to Halifax, they brought back with them. And they tried to identify every single body. So some of the families reclaimed the bodies and gave them the proper burial for whatever their faith was. The ones they didn't know, they buried to the best of their knowledge in cemeteries in Halifax. And you remember that gentleman, Mr. Navratil, who had the 2 sons traveling under a false name? He was Christian, but he was traveling in a Jewish cemetery in Halifax because his name at the time was Jewish.
What started your interest in this?
The exhibit back in 2002, when I had to be an officer, and they said, Rob, being an officer from Titanic for the exhibition, research it. We already have somebody playing the chief officer, so find somebody else. So I looked at all the senior officers and the junior officers, and when I read Lightoller's story, which I wish I had another 2 hours to tell you about, it's just amazing. So that's what got me interested.
You didn't tell the significance of the sundowner.
Thank you, and we'll do that, and I'm willing to stay for another hour if you guys want.
No, but I think that's.
But I'll tell you the Sundowner. The Sundowner was that yacht that I showed you before, and that was Lightoller's yacht. And what it was is after he retired from the White Star Line, he loved little boats. He loved tooling around in boats, and he wanted his own yacht, but he couldn't quite afford it. So an acquaintance of his said, there's an old Army pinnace, which was basically not a rowboat, not a lifeboat. It was a kind of a tender. He said, you can kind of cut this down to the bare bones, you can extend it, you can put an engine in, you can do other things, and for a lot less money than you think you can have a beautiful yacht. So he created that, and he loved sailing it with his family, but his family got older, they moved off and did other things, and the World War II broke out. A couple of important things about the Sundowner. In 1939, before World War II broke out, actually it might have been 1940, 39, the British government knew that they were very underinformed about the German coastline. They had not done a lot of reconnaissance on it. So they needed somebody with a sailing background, with a Navy background, who could not raise too much suspicion and go and reconnoiter around the German coastline, take photos, take bearings, take notes, find out where placements were, the different garrisons, guns, things like that. So who's they pick? Lightoller and his little ship Sundown. Now Sylvia, his wife, was not going to be left behind. Plus she thought it would make a better cover if he was there. He was 66 years old at the time, I think, something like that, 65, 66. So they went as a traveling British couple on their yacht, the Sundowner, traveling up the coast of Europe, over to the German coast, and they went and they tooled around, and he would take his photos to the portholes down below and take his notes, and Sylvia would sit up on the Sundowner and knit and things like that. And if there was any danger, she would call down below. So the only time they ran into a problem was in Wilhelmshaven, and a German ship came by, and they started waving, and Sylvia was up there, and she's knitting. She waves back like this. And so finally they're getting annoyed, and they're going, well, there's got to be a man on board the boat. So the Germans call over, Wo ist der Kapitän? Wo ist der Kapitän? Der Kapitän! So finally Lightoller, he puts all his stuff away down below. He comes up the ladder, he comes up onto the deck, holding a bottle of gin. And he's veering around like this, he's waving at the German Navy over there, he's drinking his stuff. They look back at him and they go. So that's how close he was to being caught. That was amazing. Now, later, you might have heard of the evacuation of Dunkirk early in the war, where hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers were stranded in Dunkirk on the coast of France. So they called anybody who had a small yacht, motorboat, anything that could cross the English Channel to go evacuate and rescue some of these folks. So Lightoller offered his services, and at first they wanted to put a Navy crew on there, but he said, no, this is my yacht, I'm going. I'm a retired naval officer, my son Roger here can go with me, and they had a Sea Scout who was a neighbor who went with them as well. So they went across the British Channel without any guns on their ship. And this is a little yacht that never held more than 20 people. It was 10 people comfortably, 20 if they liked each other, you see. And they went across the English Channel with Germans flying above, shooting down at them, barely evading them all the time. They finally make it into Dunkirk. They get up to the pier, but at that time there's no way to get to the shore, so there happened to be a destroyer there. So they pulled up next to the destroyer so people can go onto the destroyer from the wharf down to the Sundowner, which was down below here. And the person who was loading the ship said, how many can you take aboard, Lightoller? And he looked around, and they'd already stripped out the ship, so there was nothing in there they didn't need. 100. So they started loading the ship. And Roger was down below, his son, and he kept calling up after, every 10 or so, how many you got down there? 50, how you doing? Okay, we can take more. So they kept loading and loading and loading and loading until there were 130 soldiers.
Oh my God.
And it was so packed full that if somebody sneezed funny, it would list to one side or the other. So doing that, they had to make their way back across the English Channel under German fire this whole way. And when they finally got back to England, and they got up to report out and have the people disembark, most of the people were below decks. There were only so many on top. And so when he got up and he reported to the officer in charge there in England, he said, well, how many do you have on board? 130? And he thought he was joking. So he just thought, you've only got these guys that are up here. So they started learning about their counting. They got to like 50 or so. Okay, that's it. And the guys started to walk away. Hold on! And they started coming up. One after another, after another, after another. The only real danger they were in the whole time was when they got in sight of the English port where they were going to be landing. And everybody got so excited, they all stood up when the boat leaned. So back on that upside-down lifeboat, remember from Titanic, he was telling them, lean to the left, lean to the right. So that was the biggest danger they were in. So he was a hero his entire life. So with that said, I know you guys need to get going for the evening. I want to leave you with one final story. Now, there are, fortunately, no lives have been lost since Titanic in North Atlantic due to icebergs, but there have been some close calls. And the one that I like to remember the most happened in 1935, 23 years after Titanic sank. A ship was traveling in the North Atlantic Ocean in the month of April, traveling from England to Canada. It was a coal ship. And it was a very foggy night. It was hard to see, poor weather conditions. There was a crewman on board by the name of William Reeves. Now, this happened to be near the same waters where Titanic went down, because this wasn't a passenger ship, and they were going to Canada. They could travel a little bit further north. So Mr. William Reeves wasn't even on watch. He was just somewhere else in the ship, when all of a sudden, he just got this sense about him. And he ran up to the bridge, and he said, "Iceberg, straight ahead!" So they stopped the ship, and they waited, and they stared into the distance as the light started to come up, and they saw a huge field of ice in front of them. Now, the remarkable thing is, Mr. William Reeves, on board the ship, which happened to be named Titanium, was born on April 15th, 1912, at the same time Titanic sank. So you might say that Mr. William Reeves had a guardian angel, or I like to think 1,503 guardian angels looking over his shoulder. So what I encourage all of you folks to do is to think about your personal life, to think about what you can do to help others, what you can do to bring light to the world. And I want to leave you with Charles Lightollers' family motto, which comes from the Gospel of Matthew 5:16 in the Good Book. And the motto in Latin is, Luciat lux vestra, which means, let your light shine. Thank you.
Everybody, we want to thank you for coming out this evening. We hope you enjoyed